Hello and welcome to Natasha Explains It All. Today's episode is another short one that is about another resource as we are heading into the November 5th presidential election in the United States, and wanted to highlight this resource as one that you might actually utilize yourself or might want to donate to help get out the vote. And this is Pizza to the Polls, which is a nonprofit organization that has extremely simple premise, which is that they send pizza to polling stations where there are long lines, with the goal being that if they can give people food, then people will be incentivized to stay in line and to vote, which is critically important in any election, but as we know, this one has particular importance. And you can request that Pizza to the Polls send pizza to your polling station. If you are noticing the line is more than an hour to vote, you can just go onto the Pizza to the Polls website and request that pizza be sent there. And they have been sending pizza all over the country to help voters stay in line and get this and vote. And a little historical context as to why this is so important. In 2020, when we had the last presidential election, it was in the middle of a pandemic. And it was, many people faced many long, multi-hour lines, particularly in areas that were predominantly non-white. But that turnout was absolutely essential to securing the presidency for Joe Biden. And in response to that, there were several states who were upset by how many people turned out to vote and thereby giving Joe Biden the presidency, that in Republican dominated states, many types of voting restrictions then went into effect. And I want to highlight Georgia specifically because it relates directly to the story of Pizza to the Polls. In the 2020 election, Georgia went blue for the first time since 1992. Georgia voted for a Democratic president for the last time in 1992 with Bill Clinton, and then it didn't happen again until 2020 with Joe Biden. At the same time, Georgia also elected two Democratic senators, Raphael Warnock and Jon Ossoff, who continued to be the senators from Georgia. And the last time that Georgia had two Democratic senators was in the early 2000s. So Georgia had a blue trifecta in 2020, two Democratic senators, and voted for the Democrat for presidency. And I don't actually know when was the last time that has happened in Georgia, if ever. And so as a result of that, the Republican-dominated legislature in Georgia, along with Republican Governor Brian Kemp, passed legislation called SB 202 to restrict voting in many ways, because they didn't want a repeat of what they saw in 2020. They didn't want Democrats to be able to win now in 2024. And one of the provisions of SB 202, which is the law in Georgia, is that it criminalizes the provision of food and water to voters who are waiting in line to vote. And this is one of many voting restrictions that SB 202 includes. So in Georgia, it is now a crime to provide food and water to voters waiting in line to vote. And again, this is a direct attempt by Republican leadership in the state of Georgia to suppress the vote and to discourage people from going out to vote, particularly in predominantly non-white areas where there are notoriously long lines to vote, which is related to other restrictions that the Republican legislature has implemented. So, for example, Georgia has been slowly changing in terms of its demographics. It's been leaning more and more Democratic as there has been a change in the demographics of the state, and particularly with population centers like Atlanta. And as a result, Republicans have been, chipping away at voting rights in various ways. And one of those has also been to cut the number of polling places, predominantly in areas that are majority non-white or have high non-white populations. So you have fewer polling places. So people can vote at fewer places, which will inevitably result in longer lines. And now the provision of food and water to help people, stay through multi-hour waits is, that's now a crime. And so Pizza to the Poll, these restrictions were in direct response to efforts by organizations like Pizza to the Polls to help people stay in line through multi-hour waits to vote, and the ensuing result of Georgia electing the Democratic candidate for presidency and 2 Democratic senators. And so, unfortunately, to this day in Georgia, Pizza to the Polls, their work is restricted, right? They have to follow the law because it's criminalized to provide food or water to people who are waiting in line to vote. So anyway, there have been, as you may have been reading, there have been various efforts in various Republican-dominated states to restrict access to the vote in light of Joe Biden's win in 2020. And one of those has been on impacting, the availability of polling stations, the availability of absentee voting, right? Vote by mail. A lot of states expanded vote by mail in 2020 because of the pandemic. But then a lot of those states then went, got rid of that and have gone back to providing fewer options to vote by mail, and various other restrictions, including, what kind of powers the state election boards have to count votes and when they count the votes. There's a lot more detail that we can save for a longer discussion in another episode. But I just wanted to highlight this cool organization, Pizza to the Polls, that is helping people stay in line, stay focused, stay hydrated, have food so that they can get through and vote. Because again, a lot of states, there's not a lot of absentee voting options. There are few polling stations, and enthusiasm is really high. We've been seeing really, really high early voting turnout throughout the country, including in all of the swing states, and this is fantastic. And we want to keep the momentum going the next few days. And so Pizza to the Polls is one of the organizations that is trying to do that. It is a nonpartisan organization. It's a nonprofit. They'll send pizza to any polling place where there is an hour plus line to vote. But the historical context as to, why it does the work it does and why it's so important for this particular election very much, unfortunately, a partisan story, because Republicans throughout the country have been continuously implementing methods to make it harder to vote. And we saw that the various periods in U.S. history, but more recently in 2014 with the Supreme Court case of Shelby County v. Holder, which gutted one of the sections of the National Voting Rights Act, which got rid of the pre-clearance requirement. And then more recently now in 2020, post Joe Biden's win. And I believe I've talked about in another episode about the pre-clearance requirement and Shelby v. Holder. So just very briefly, the National Voting Rights Act, one of the provisions that it had was states that were notorious for suppressing the vote. If they were going to make any changes to their election laws, they had to get those changes cleared with the federal government, with Department of Justice, before they implemented them. Knowing that these states had a history of implementing things like poll taxes and literacy tests and other things that were designed to suppress the vote, particularly of Black Americans. And so this pre-clearance thing worked to help ensure the right to vote for all Americans. But in 2014, the Supreme Court, with a conservative majority, was like, yeah, we don't need that anymore. Times have changed. We have a Black president. There's no more racism. So we don't need this pre-clearance requirement, which is ridiculous, but that's what they said. And as a result, shocking, those same states then started to implement lots of voting restrictions, and they didn't have to get the federal government's okay to implement them anymore. So we had a whole wave of voting restrictions followed the 2014 Supreme Court decision in Shelby County v. Holder. And then we had a whole wave of voting restrictions come in following 2020 and Joe Biden's win. And so we are continuing to see that fallout through this election. And I don't want to end it on a negative note, because Kamala's going to win. It's going to be okay. Democracy will live to fight another day. But I want to give people another way to plug in, another way to help, a fun way. And hopefully this, and if this impacts you as well, hopefully you can use this resource to make sure that people where you are voting can stay in line, can vote, and that every last vote gets counted. So anyway, we'll just end it there. But check out Pizza to the Polls. I've donated myself. I really do try to, limit my recommendations to organizations that I myself have contributed to, or, I'm personally familiar with. And let's win this thing. All right. Thanks so much for listening, and see you next time.